I remember the mountains like a shadowed dream, the Appalachians rising and falling in endless folds of green, blue, and gray, as if the earth itself had decided to breathe and never exhale. 6 years ago, when I first set foot along the ridges that ran between North Carolina and Tennessee, I was still just a man hungry for solitude, for answers I couldn't find in the city's noise. I had left behind a life most would have considered steady, an apartment with thin walls, a job at a surveying company, evenings filled with neon and televisions and voices that said everything without meaning a word. The mountains, though, spoke in silence. The wind over the pines, the black bears shuffling through undergrowth, the whisper of unseen rivers cutting valleys. All of it called me into a place where I thought I could vanish, not forever, just for a while, and listen to something older than myself. But what I found, or what found me, was nothing I had ever expected. The trail that year was overgrown in places, the spring rains heavier than usual, feeding ferns that curled like ancient scrolls and flowers bursting through every clearing. I carried everything I needed in a worn pack: tent, stove, rope, maps, compass, notebook. My plan was simple: follow a section of the Appalachian Trail, veer off onto side paths where few went, and spend weeks cataloging my own thoughts more than the land. I told no one exactly where I would be. That was my mistake, maybe the first in a series that brought me to where I am now. People vanish in the Appalachians more often than outsiders realize. The land is vast, layered with hollows and ridges, caves and sinkholes, endless stretches where a single misstep can make you invisible to search parties. The forest doesn't give back what it takes, not easily. The first week was uneventful. I logged miles, scribbled notes in my journal about how the sun bent its light in the early mist, about the strange way rocks along certain ridges seemed aligned, as if placed by a hand too deliberate to be mere accident. Locals I met in a small mountain town warned me not to wander too far from the marked trails. Old caves out there, one man said, his accent thick, his eyes sharper than I expected. Some best left sealed by God's hand. I laughed politely, bought a handful of supplies at his store, and walked back into the green wilderness. At the time, I believed in cliffs and rivers, in maps and compasses, not in whispers and old fears. But the farther I went, the more I noticed a pull, like something unseen arranging my steps, urging me into hollows darker than twilight even at noon. It was on the 12th day, deep in a ravine where the trail had thinned to little more than deer tracks, that I found the cave. Its mouth was narrow, half hidden by rhododendron thickets and fallen stone. The air spilling from within was cold, unnaturally so, carrying a smell I couldn't place, metallic, faintly sweet, almost electrical. I should have walked past. But I had always been curious, the sort of man who pried open boxes labeled "Do Not Open" just to see what was inside. I lit my headlamp, set my pack at the entrance, and slid inside. The ceiling dropped low, forcing me to crawl at first, but then the passage widened into a chamber. My light cut across walls lined with markings, not carvings, not scratches, but something that looked burned into the rock itself, looping spirals and jagged symbols that no natural process could have etched. I remember my chest tightening, not from fear at first, but awe, like I had stumbled into a cathedral built for something not human. I explored deeper, each step echoing against stone, until the chamber sloped downward into water. A pool, perfectly still, reflecting my light like a mirror. I leaned closer, and that was when I heard it, the faintest hum, low, steady, almost mechanical. I froze. It didn't sound like wind, or dripping water, or any movement of earth. It sounded like a signal, something vibrating just below hearing, rattling in my bones. I switched off my headlamp, and in the darkness, the pool glowed faintly, a blue shimmer spreading outward like veins of light beneath the surface. My breath caught. I stumbled back, fumbling for the lamp, and when light returned, the glow was gone. The hum remained, pulsing through the rock. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to decide if I had gone mad. Eventually, I turned and left the cave, the daylight outside burning my eyes with relief. I told myself I wouldn't return, But that night in my tent, as the forest pressed close, I heard it again. The hum, not from the cave this time, but vibrating through the ground beneath me, as if the mountain itself was alive and breathing in sync with that hidden chamber. Sleep never came. By dawn, I had convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind. Still, I marked the location on my map, a small cross in red ink, a place I swore I'd investigate when I was ready. Days blurred into weeks. I moved on, but I couldn't escape the pull. My journal filled with sketches of spirals, notes about strange lights glimpsed between trees, shadows where no one stood. Food tasted flat, water seemed heavy, and every night the hum grew louder, even when I camped miles away. Sometimes I woke with nosebleeds, my dreams thick with images of tunnels twisting into infinity, of figures standing in the glow of that subterranean pool. I started to fear the silence more than the sound itself, because when the hum ceased for brief moments, the forest felt hollow, emptied of life. The birds wouldn't sing. Even the insects stilled. When I finally turned back toward the cave, weeks later, it wasn't a decision, it was inevitability. My feet carried me without thought, as though I had been summoned. I reached the ravine at dusk, the same metallic chill seeping through the air. My pack was lighter now, most supplies gone, my beard grown wild, my eyes sunken from nights without sleep. But none of it mattered. I was going back inside, deeper than before. That was the last memory I have before everything fractured, before time lost its shape. What happened after inside those tunnels is something I still struggle to explain, something that 6 years of wandering in silence hasn't made clearer. But I know this. I vanished from the world above, as if erased, my name whispered by search parties that combed the ridges, my face stapled on missing posters that faded in rain. I wasn't dead, though I might as well have been. I belonged to the mountain now, to the hum that had claimed me. And all that remained of me up there was the echo of boots in the mud, a pack abandoned near a cave no one could ever seem to find again. When people speak of vanishing, they imagine something sudden. One step taken, a scream in the distance, a body never found. But my disappearance wasn't a snap of fingers or a trapdoor opening beneath me. It was gradual, like fog rolling into a valley, until I couldn't see where I had come from or where I was headed. The deeper I moved into that cave system, the less I felt tethered to the life I had left behind. The rope I had tied at the entrance slipped from my grip when the tunnel sloped sharply, and by the time I stopped sliding, the way back was gone, swallowed by darkness and stone. My lamp flickered, my hands raw from scraping a long rock, but the hum, that constant, vibrating undertone, had grown stronger, more insistent, guiding me through twists and drops as if it wanted me deeper. At first, I cursed myself for my recklessness, swore that when I found a way out, I'd never let curiosity drag me past the threshold of safety again. But a voice inside me whispered otherwise, a voice that wasn't entirely my own. The tunnels seemed alive. Walls glistened with a mineral sheen, like veins lit from within, pulsing faintly as though carrying some subterranean current. My compass spun uselessly, pointing nowhere. The air smelled sharper the farther I went, like ozone after a lightning strike, and with each breath, I felt both heavier and more awake. Hours passed, or days, I couldn't tell, before I stumbled into another chamber, vast and circular, the ceiling vanishing into blackness. At its center lay a structure, not natural, not carved by erosion or time. It was made of stone, yes, but stacked in ways too deliberate, with lines too precise to be random. A pillar rose from the floor, etched with the same spirals I had seen before, glowing faintly as if lit from within. When I reached out and touched it, the hum surged, crawling through my bones, and a flood of images filled my mind, flashes of stars and patterns I didn't recognize, oceans boiling, faces I had never seen yet somehow remembered. I dropped to my knees, clutching my skull, but the vision pressed on, relentless. When it ended, I was alone again in the chamber, gasping, the pillar dim and silent. I staggered back, desperate for air, desperate for light that wasn't borrowed from my failing headlamp. I don't remember how long I wandered after that, but when I finally collapsed, it was into a kind of sleep that didn't feel like sleep at all. My body rested, but my mind drifted elsewhere. Walking through corridors of stone lit by an unseen glow, hearing voices call my name in tones both soothing and commanding. They told me to let go of time, to surrender to the hum, that the mountain was not a prison but a passage. When I woke, my throat dry and my lamp dead, I wasn't afraid anymore. I should have been terrified, lost in a maze no one could map, but instead I felt a strange calm, as though I had already crossed a threshold and fear no longer applied. The days, or what I called days, though time was fractured, blurred into one another. Hunger came and went in waves, but when no food remained, I didn't starve. The water dripping from stones sustained me in ways I couldn't explain. Sometimes I thought I was dying, body wasting away in some hidden cavern, yet my strength returned again and again, as though something in those tunnels was feeding me, keeping me alive for reasons I couldn't fathom. I began to hear patterns in the hum, not just vibration but language, coded and complex, threading meaning into my dreams. I tried to write in my journal, but the words twisted, spirals filling the page until I tore the paper and screamed into the dark. When the search parties scoured the ridges above, I didn't know. But later, I felt them. The hum shifted, higher, sharper, as though responding to footsteps above ground, as though the mountain itself was aware of their presence. Sometimes, faintly, I heard voices calling my name through cracks in the rock. I screamed back until my throat bled, but no one heard. Or maybe they did, and it reached them only as a gust of wind, a trickle of water, something they dismissed as natural. That was the cruelty of it, so close, yet utterly beyond reach. My world was sealed beneath layers of stone, and theirs moved on, leaving me as a ghost wandering corridors no map would ever show. 6 years passed this way, though I only know because I've pieced it together since. Down there, time was not linear. Sometimes I dreamed entire lifetimes, woke convinced decades had gone by, only to see the same chamber, the same spiral glowing faintly. Other times I blinked, and days vanished, my beard grown longer, my body thinner, the echoes in my ears louder. The mountain was remaking me, stripping away what I had been, reshaping me into something else. I stopped thinking of myself as a man in the ordinary sense. I was a vessel, a receiver, tuned to a signal no one else could hear. When the explorers came years later, though for me it felt like moments, I felt them before I saw them. Their lights pierced cracks in the stone, their laughter echoing faintly as they joked about abandoned mines and ghost stories. I wanted to run to them, to beg for release, but the mountain held me fast. The hum surged, drowning my thoughts, commanding silence. Still, when their instruments picked up the signal, when they paused at the mouth of a cave half-collapsed by time, I knew the moment had come. The signal was no longer mine alone to bear. The world above had finally heard the mountain whisper, and with it, the truth that had claimed me 6 years before. Had thought, in some corner of my fractured mind, that after so many years below, I would leap at the sight of other humans, that I would claw my way through stone just to be near their voices again. But when those explorers drew close, their lamps flickering against the jagged walls, I found myself retreating deeper into shadow. I was not the man who had walked into this cave with a backpack and curiosity. My skin had grown pale from years without sunlight, almost translucent in places, veins glowing faintly with the same blue shimmer that pulsed in the subterranean pool. My eyes, once hazel, now reflected light like an animal's in the dark, catching their beams with an unnatural gleam. My voice, unused for so long, rasped in my throat like dry stone on stone. I wanted to call out, but something in me feared what they would see. A thing neither fully man nor entirely other, a creature molded by years of listening to the hum. They came in pairs, carrying equipment I didn't recognize. Not simple hiking packs, but strange receivers, devices with antennas and glowing screens. They were not tourists, nor casual spelunkers. They were chasing something. I overheard fragments of their words as they set their gear near the entrance chamber. Signal fluctuation, repeating intervals, not natural. They were drawn by the same sound that had once lured me. But unlike me, they had machines to confirm it wasn't imagination. The mountain was speaking again, and this time, someone else had heard. I crept along the edges of the chamber, silent as the drip of water, listening as they argued about whether to proceed deeper. Some wanted to mark the cave and return with a larger team. Others pressed forward, intoxicated by discovery. I knew what awaited them if they went too far. The spirals, the pillar, the visions, they weren't just carvings and illusions. They were a threshold, and once crossed, there was no coming back unchanged. I tried to warn them. I scratched spirals into the stone near their gear, symbols I had traced 1,000 times in the dark. But when they noticed, they dismissed it as old markings left by long-gone miners or local kids. One man laughed, saying, "Every cave has its graffiti." If only they had understood. The hum pulsed stronger that night, a rhythm that echoed through the chambers like a heartbeat, quickening as though sensing fresh blood. I could feel it in my chest, my bones, the marrow itself vibrating with anticipation. The mountain was awake, aware of new voices intruding on its silence, and it would not let them leave unmarked. The explorers ventured further, their lamps cutting spears of light into the abyss. I followed at a distance, a shadow behind shadows. When they reached the great chamber with the pillar, I saw their faces shift. First disbelief, then awe, then unease. Their devices beeped wildly, screens flashing with signals beyond their calibration. The spirals along the stone glowed faintly again, stronger with each passing moment, feeding on their presence. They circled the pillar, touched it as I once had, and when a surge of vision struck them, I watched them stagger, clutching their heads. Some screamed. One dropped his equipment and fell to his knees, eyes wide with terror. I remembered my own first vision, the stars, the oceans, the faces, and knew they were now sharing the burden. The mountain wasn't whispering anymore. It was speaking plainly, and it was too late for them to walk away. I should have pitied them. Instead, I felt something darker, envy. They still had each other, voices to lean on, hands to steady trembling bodies. I had endured it alone, and in my solitude I had become half feral, more attuned to stone than skin. Watching them, I realized how much of my humanity had been stripped away. Yet I could not step forward, could not reveal myself, not yet. The mountain still held me, its hum tightening around my mind like chains. It told me to wait, to observe, to let them sink further before intervening. And I obeyed, as I always had. Over the following days, if days they were, the explorers set up a base camp near the entrance. They came and went in small groups, some mapping tunnels, others cataloging the markings, their voices echoing through the caverns with excitement and fear. They argued late into the night, debating whether the spirals were evidence of lost civilizations, ancient rituals, or something beyond human history. A few whispered about radio frequencies, electromagnetic anomalies, the possibility of communication. But none of them dared speak aloud what their eyes betrayed when the hum grew loudest, that they were no longer in control, that the mountain was studying them as much as they were studying it. I hovered always at the edge of their awareness. A figure glimpsed in the corner of vision, a rustle of stone that made them shine their lights into darkness. Once, a young woman swore she saw a man watching from the shadows. The others laughed it off, blaming fatigue and nerves, but her fear lingered. She began sketching spirals in her notebook without realizing it, the same shapes that filled my own journal years before. The mountain had marked her. It was only a matter of time. And yet, for all their technology, they could not hear the hum the way I did. To them, it was faint, detectable only through instruments. To me, it was as loud as a storm, layered with meaning, words I almost understood but never fully grasped. It whispered not in English, not in any tongue of men, but in vibrations that bypassed language altogether, drilling directly into thought. Sometimes I wondered if I was even still human enough to distinguish between myself and the signal. The line blurred with each passing moment. The night they finally reached the pool, the glowing water that had first entranced me, I knew the true test had begun. They gathered around its edge, lamps flickering against the shimmering. The pool had marked them, though none of them would admit it at first. I could see it in the way their eyes lingered on the water, in the silence that grew between them where laughter had once been. Their instruments, once steady and precise, began to glitch and fail, screens filling with spirals of static, their compasses spinning as mine once had. They argued more often, their tempers fraying, voices echoing harshly in the stone chambers. Some grew restless, wandering away from the group as if called by unseen hands. Others refused to sleep, staring at the walls as though waiting for them to move. I recognized every sign. I had lived them myself in those first weeks after touching the pillar and gazing into the pool. The mountain was inside them now, its hum resonating in marrow and mind, reshaping them as it had reshaped me. I kept my distance, though part of me longed to step forward and tell them the truth, that there was no way out, not anymore, not once the signal had taken root. But I knew the reaction such words would bring. They would see only a gaunt figure, eyes glowing faintly in the dark, a specter whispering doom. They would recoil, perhaps attack, and the mountain would not permit me to intervene too early. So I watched, and I listened, and I waited for the inevitable unraveling. Their journals filled with erratic entries, spirals drawn in margins, sentences unfinished, whole pages blacked out by ink. Their voices, when they spoke into recorders, often dissolved into static upon playback, as though the devices could not capture words bent by the hum. One by one, they began to hear it, not through machines, but with their own ears. It started subtly, a faint vibration at the edge of perception. They dismissed it at first as equipment interference, tinnitus, or the rumbling of distant water. But soon it grew louder, undeniable. Some covered their ears, swearing the sound was driving them mad. Others embraced it, sitting in silence, as though listening to a sermon only they could understand. The group fractured along those lines, the skeptics, desperate to cling to reason, and the believers, who surrendered eagerly to the pulse of the mountain. Conflict rose, sharp and bitter, and I knew it was only a matter of time before blood would be spilled. The mountain feeds on division as much as devotion. I recall one night in particular, when their campfire cast wavering shadows on the chamber walls. Two of them argued until voices turned to shouts, and then to blows. The others tried to separate them, but the hum surged, a violent tremor rattling the stone around us. It was as if the mountain itself demanded escalation, as if it craved sacrifice. One man seized a rock and struck his companion across the skull. The chamber went silent, but for the echo of the blow, and the fallen man lay motionless, his blood seeping into cracks of stone. The hum softened, steady again, almost satisfied. The killer dropped the rock, trembling, but no one spoke. They all felt it, the acceptance of the mountain, the way it seemed to reward the act. From that moment, fear and reverence became one. I should have felt horror. Once long ago, I would have. But as I watched from the shadows, I felt only inevitability. This was the pattern, the cycle I had come to understand. The mountain does not lure the curious without purpose. It tests them, breaks them, remakes them. Death is not an accident here. It is an offering. And for each offering, the hum grows stronger, resonating deeper into the bones of those who remain. The survivors did not flee. They gathered the body and laid it by the pool, as though compelled. The water shimmered faintly, accepting the gift. When they returned to their camp, their faces were pale, but their eyes glowed with the same faint shimmer I had seen in my own reflection years before. Days or nights, or some measure of time beyond reckoning, passed in a haze of ritual. The explorers stopped recording data, stopped arguing about science. Instead, they began to chant in low voices, repeating tones that mirrored the hum. They traced spirals on their skin with soot from the fire, marking themselves as vessels. I watched them transform, the same way I had, but faster, more complete, as though the mountain had refined its process over the years. Their individuality eroded, replaced by unity and vibration, a chorus tuned to the frequency of the stone. I realized then why I had been kept alive all this time, why I had not withered away in silence. I was to be the witness, the bridge, the first of many. My solitude had prepared me to understand, and now I was to see the pattern continue, the mountain extending its reach into the world through new voices. Yet a fragment of my old self still stirred, a voice that whispered of the world above, the sky, the wind through trees, the laughter of strangers in mountain towns. That voice urged me to act, to intervene before the explorers vanished entirely as I had. Perhaps if I revealed myself, I could warn them, break the cycle. Perhaps they would listen, and together we might find a way out. The thought haunted me, gnawed at me, until one night I could no longer resist. I stepped into the firelight, my figure casting long shadows on the chamber wall. Their eyes turned to me, wide, their murmurs halting. For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy. Leave, I rasped, my voice like gravel. Leave before it takes you all. The words echoed, alien even to my own ears. Some gasped, others whispered prayers. The young woman who had once glimpsed me in shadows trembled, her spiral-marked hands clutched to her chest. But the leader of their group, an older man with steel-gray hair and eyes hardened by stubborn reason, stepped forward. He looked at me not with fear, but with defiance. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Another lost soul? A hermit hiding in these caves? You've been here too long. You're sick. The mountain's broken you." I wanted to argue, to explain, but the hum surged again, drowning my thoughts. My body shook as though pulled by invisible strings, my words strangled before they could form. The explorers watched, torn between fear and fascination, as I collapsed to my knees, clutching my skull. The hum spoke through me then, a chorus not my own, vibrating my bones until my chest ached. Words spilled from my lips in a language none of us knew, yet all of us felt. The spirals on the walls glowed brighter, the pool shimmered, and the explorers fell to their knees, eyes wide, as though witnessing revelation. I was no longer a man to them. I was the vessel of the mountain, the proof of its power. In that moment, I knew I had lost whatever chance I had to save them. They were no longer explorers seeking knowledge, but disciples seeking communion. And I, whether I wished it or not, had become their prophet. The transformation of the explorers into disciples happened faster than I could have imagined. Where once they had carried equipment and journals, now they carried stones marked with spirals, torches blackened with soot, and shards of crystal taken from the walls of the chambers. They sang at night in tones that resonated with the hum, building harmonies that rattled the very air. Their words grew fewer, replaced by vibrations and sounds that bypassed language altogether. They were not individuals anymore. They were becoming one body, one mind, fused into the rhythm of the mountain. And I, pale, gaunt, trembling with the weight of years and darkness, was their anchor, their living evidence that this path led somewhere beyond human understanding. They looked at me not as a warning, but as a promise. I tried to resist their devotion, but it was impossible. Every time I looked into their eyes, I saw reflections of myself, the same hunger, the same surrender. When they asked me to speak, I wanted to say no, but the words that came out were not mine. They poured from me in spirals of sound, messages I could not comprehend, but that they seemed to understand instinctively. Their faces lit with awe as they listened, nodding in unison, tears streaming down their cheeks as though they had heard the voice of God. I was horrified, but I was powerless. The mountain had hollowed me out long ago, and now it used me as its mouthpiece, filling me with vibrations I could neither block nor refuse. One night, they gathered around the pool again, this time not with instruments, but with offerings. They carried fragments of bone, animal or human, I could not tell, wrapped in cloth marked with spirals. They placed them into the glowing water, and the pool rippled, light spreading outward in concentric circles. The hum swelled, resonating so strongly that the stone beneath our feet shuddered. The disciples, for I could no longer call them explorers, fell prostrate, their voices raised in harmonic tones that matched the vibration of the chamber itself. I stood among them, unwilling yet unable to step aside, and when the glow rose high enough to paint our faces, I realized that the mountain had grown stronger with their devotion. Its reach was no longer confined to stone and shadow. It was stretching outward, seeding itself through their minds into the world above. That realization broke something in me. For years I had endured the hum alone, trapped in its labyrinth, my humanity eroded bit by bit. But now I saw what came next, not just the claiming of lost wanderers, but the spreading of the signal beyond the mountains. These disciples would not stay forever. Some would return to the world, carrying spirals in their journals, chants in their throats, signals in their blood. They would speak of discoveries, of strange frequencies, of caves glowing with light. And slowly, others would follow, drawn as moths to flame, until the mountain's voice reached further than it ever had. I could not let that happen. Somewhere deep in the shell of myself, the last flicker of who I had once been awoke, and it whispered one desperate word: resist. Resisting the mountain was like fighting the tide with bare hands. The hum surged whenever I thought of defiance, shaking my bones until I collapsed, leaving me gasping on the stone floor. My visions grew violent, images of fire-consuming forests, of oceans swallowing cities, of stars falling like ash. The mountain was not merely alive. It was aware, vast, and ancient, and it did not forgive rebellion. Still, I clung to that flicker of self. I remembered the sky, the faces of people I had known, the laughter of strangers in towns I once passed through. I remembered who I was before I became a vessel. And I knew that if I surrendered entirely, the world above would not remain untouched for long. So I waited. I watched the disciples, learned their patterns, listened to the rhythms of their chants. They trusted me completely, never questioning when I moved among them, never doubting that the words I spoke were holy. That trust became my weapon. Quietly, I began planting doubt, not in all of them, but in one. The young woman who had first seen me in the shadows, who had once trembled at my warning, still carried a spark of fear in her eyes. When the others slept in uneasy harmony, I whispered to her, not in the mountain's voice but in my own. I told her of the world outside, of sunlight and rivers and the wind in the trees. I told her that escape was possible if only she dared to resist. At first she recoiled, torn between faith and fear. But slowly, she began to listen. It was a dangerous gamble. The mountain knew. I felt its rage boiling in the hum whenever I planted seeds of doubt. My visions grew worse, my body weaker, nosebleeds staining the stone. Yet I pressed on because she was my last hope. I could not save them all, but perhaps I could save one. Perhaps through her, the truth could reach the world above, not the disciples' truth, twisted by devotion, but the warning that the mountain was awake and hungry. I told her where the tunnels narrowed, where light sometimes flickered through cracks in the stone, where the hum faltered just enough to allow thought. She listened, memorizing every detail, though her hands trembled when she traced spirals on her arms in the presence of the others. She was caught between two masters, the mountain and me. The night came when she tried. While the others chanted around the pool, their voices rising in harmony, she slipped away into the tunnels. I followed at a distance, heart pounding, praying silently that the mountain would not notice. For a time, it seemed possible. She moved swiftly, her lamp cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. But then the hum surged, violent and furious, rattling the stone with such force that shards fell from the ceiling. She stumbled, nearly crushed by falling rock. I rushed forward, catching her arm, pulling her to her feet. Her eyes met mine, wide with terror, and in that moment I knew the mountain would not let her go. Not willingly. The others arrived soon after, drawn by the tremors. They seized her, their faces twisted not with anger but with sorrow, as though watching a child stray from the path. They carried her back to the pool, ignoring her screams, and laid her at its edge. The hum swelled, deafening, and the water flared with light. I fought to intervene, but the mountain's grip locked my limbs, forcing me to kneel in silence as she was lowered into the glowing depths. The water closed over her, her cries muffled into nothing, and then the pool stilled. When it cleared, she was gone. Not drowned, not floating. Gone, as if the mountain had swallowed her whole. The disciples wept, chanting louder, their devotion renewed. I knelt in silence, shaking, the last flicker of my old self-guttering. I had tried to resist, and I had failed. The mountain was too strong, too vast, too ancient. And now, as the pool shimmered, the transformation of the explorers into disciples happened faster than I could have imagined. Where once they had carried equipment and journals, now they carried stones marked with spirals, torches blackened with soot, and shards of crystal taken from the walls of the chambers. They sang at night in tones that resonated with the hum, building harmonies that rattled the very air. Their words grew fewer, replaced by vibrations and sounds that bypassed language altogether. They were not individuals anymore. They were becoming one body, one mind, fused into the rhythm of the mountain. And I, pale, gaunt, trembling with the weight of years and darkness, was their anchor, their living evidence that this path led somewhere beyond human understanding. They looked at me not as a warning, but as a promise. I tried to resist their devotion, but it was impossible. Every time I looked into their eyes, I saw reflections of myself, the same hunger, the same surrender. When they asked me to speak, I wanted to say no, but the words that came out were not mine. They poured from me in spirals of sound, messages I could not comprehend, but that they seemed to understand instinctively. Their faces lit with awe as they listened, nodding in unison, tears streaming down their cheeks as though they had heard the voice of God. I was horrified, but I was powerless. The mountain had hollowed me out long ago, and now it used me as its mouthpiece, filling me with vibrations I could neither block nor refuse. One night, they gathered around the pool again, this time not with instruments, but with offerings. They carried fragments of bone, animal or human, I could not tell, wrapped in cloth marked with spirals. They placed them into the glowing water, and the pool rippled, light spreading outward in concentric circles. The hum swelled, resonating so strongly that the stone beneath our feet shuddered. The disciples, for I could no longer call them explorers, fell prostrate, their voices raised in harmonic tones that matched the vibration of the chamber itself. I stood among them, unwilling yet unable to step aside, and when the glow rose high enough to paint our faces, I realized that the mountain had grown stronger with their devotion. Its reach was no longer confined to stone and shadow. It was stretching outward, seeding itself, through their minds, into the world above. That realization broke something in me. For years I had endured the hum alone, trapped in its labyrinth, my humanity eroded bit by bit. But now I saw what came next, not just the claiming of lost wanderers, but the spreading of the signal beyond the mountains. These disciples would not stay forever. Some would return to the world, carrying spirals in their journals, chants in their throats, signals in their blood. They would speak of discoveries, of strange frequencies, of caves glowing with light. And slowly, others would follow, drawn as moths to flame, until the mountain's voice reached further than it ever had. I could not let that happen. Somewhere deep in the shell of myself, the last flicker of who I had once been awoke, and it whispered one desperate word: resist. Resisting the mountain was like fighting the tide with bare hands. The hum surged whenever I thought of defiance, shaking my bones until I collapsed, leaving me gasping on the stone floor. My visions grew violent, images of fire-consuming forests, of oceans swallowing cities, of stars falling like ash. The mountain was not merely alive. It was aware, vast, and ancient, and it did not forgive rebellion. Still, I clung to that flicker of self. I remembered the sky, the faces of people I had known, the laughter of strangers in towns I once passed through. I remembered who I was before I became a vessel. And I knew that if I surrendered entirely, the world above would not remain untouched for long. So I waited. I watched the disciples, learned their patterns, listened to the rhythms of their chants. They trusted me completely, never questioning when I moved among them, never doubting that the words I spoke were holy. That trust became my weapon. Quietly, I began planting doubt, not in all of them, but in one. The young woman who had first seen me in the shadows, who had once trembled at my warning, still carried a spark of fear in her eyes. When the others slept in uneasy harmony, I whispered to her, not in the mountain's voice but in my own. I told her of the world outside, of sunlight and rivers and the wind in the trees. I told her that escape was possible if only she dared to resist. At first she recoiled, torn between faith and fear. But slowly, she began to listen. It was a dangerous gamble. The mountain knew. I felt its rage boiling in the hum whenever I planted seeds of doubt. My visions grew worse, my body weaker, nosebleeds staining the stone. Yet I pressed on because she was my last hope. I could not save them all, but perhaps I could save one. Perhaps through her, the truth could reach the world above, not the disciples' truth, twisted by devotion, but the warning that the mountain was awake and hungry. I told her where the tunnels narrowed, where light sometimes flickered through cracks in the stone, where the hum faltered just enough to allow thought. She listened, memorizing every detail, though her hands trembled when she traced spirals on her arms in the presence of the others. She was caught between two masters, the mountain and me. The night came when she tried. While the others chanted around the pool, their voices rising in harmony, she slipped away into the tunnels. I followed at a distance, heart pounding, praying silently that the mountain would not notice. For a time, it seemed possible. She moved swiftly, her lamp cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. But then the hum surged, violent and furious, rattling the stone with such force that shards fell from the ceiling. She stumbled, nearly crushed by falling rock. I rushed forward, catching her arm, pulling her to her feet. Her eyes met mine, wide with terror, and in that moment I knew the mountain would not let her go. Not willingly. The others arrived soon after, drawn by the tremors. They seized her, their faces twisted not with anger but with sorrow, as though watching a child stray from the path. They carried her back to the pool, ignoring her screams, and laid her at its edge. The hum swelled, deafening, and the water flared with light. I fought to intervene, but the mountain's grip locked my limbs, forcing me to kneel in silence as she was lowered into the glowing depths. The water closed over her, her cries muffled into nothing, and then the pool stilled. When it cleared, she was gone. Not drowned, not floating. Gone, as if the mountain had swallowed her whole. The disciples wept, chanting louder, their devotion renewed. I knelt in silence, shaking, the last flicker of my old self-guttering. I had tried to resist, and I had failed. The mountain was too strong, too vast, too ancient. And now, as the pool shimmered, faintly once more, I understood the truth. I was not meant to save anyone. I was meant to witness, to guide, to shepherd new voices into the hum. I was its prophet, not its opponent. And no matter how hard I fought, I could not escape that fate. After the young woman was taken by the pool, the disciples' transformation accelerated beyond anything I could have foreseen. It was as though her sacrifice had sealed their covenant with the mountain, binding them irrevocably to its will. They no longer spoke in fragmented words or argued among themselves. They moved in perfect unison, a congregation whose bodies were merely vessels for something greater. Their chants filled every chamber, their tones layered until the stone itself vibrated in response, walls shivering as though eager to join the chorus. At times, I could not distinguish where their voices ended and the hum began. It was all one sound now, one vast resonance that swallowed thought and bent it into shapes I did not recognize. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, not a reflection of light, but an illumination from within, veins of pale blue spreading subtly beneath their skin. They no longer ate or drank as they once had. They would sit for hours, staring at the spirals, humming softly, and when they rose, They seemed nourished by nothing but the vibration itself. I had once believed I was singular, cursed or blessed to be remade by the mountain, but now I saw that I was only the first of many. The mountain had refined its craft, using me as the rough draft of a design that it perfected in them. And unlike me, they did not resist. They surrendered willingly, eagerly, their humanity eroded not by force, but by faith. The cave system, too, began to change. Or perhaps it had always been alive, and I was only now seeing it clearly. The spirals on the walls pulsed brighter, shifting subtly as though alive, curling into new forms when no one watched. The pool's glow intensified, veins of light crawling outward through cracks in the stone, reaching into tunnels where the disciples had not yet walked. The air grew heavy with ozone, every breath sharp, filling lungs with a tingling energy that blurred the line between suffocation and ecstasy. Sometimes I thought I heard the mountain's voice not just as vibration but as words, fragments of meaning threading through the hum. Open, signal, beyond. They were commands, invitations, warnings all at once, and though I tried to resist, my body trembled with obedience. The disciples began building structures from stone and crystal, crude at first, then strangely precise, their angles matching constellations I half remembered from my visions. They erected pillars and chambers, carving spirals into their surfaces, arranging them in patterns that resonated when the hum rose. These were not shelters or monuments. They were instruments, antennae, amplifiers, designed not for human use but for the mountain itself. Through them, the signal grew louder, sharper, threading deeper into the rock and, I feared, outward into the world above. I realized then what the mountain had always sought, not merely worship, but transmission. It was not content to dwell in darkness, claiming wanderers and explorers. It wanted to be heard everywhere, in every frequency, in every bone. And still, I could not fully hate it. That was the cruelest truth of all. The longer I lived within its resonance, the more I understood its allure. The hum was not just sound, it was order, purpose, clarity in a world that had once been chaos. It stripped away doubt, fear, loneliness. In its vibration, there was belonging. My old life felt distant, meaningless, a haze of shallow conversations, false smiles, endless searching. Here I was never alone. Here, even in silence, I was part of something vast and eternal. That was how it seduced them, how it had seduced me. And yet, beneath that belonging, the flicker of resistance still smoldered. I could not forget the young woman's scream, cut short as the pool swallowed her. I could not forget the way her eyes had begged me for escape. That memory kept me tethered to myself, even as everything else frayed. I began to wonder if escape was even possible. The tunnels shifted when I tried to retrace my steps, passages narrowing or collapsing, routes folding in on themselves. The mountain reshaped itself, trapping us within its endless labyrinth. But sometimes, in the farthest chambers, I saw cracks of light, faint shafts of daylight piercing through stone. They were too small to crawl through, too fleeting to hold hope. Yet they reminded me that the world above still existed, unchanged, unaware of the signal growing beneath its soil. That thought gnawed at me. The people in their towns, living ordinary lives, had no idea what pulsed in the mountain's depths. And if the disciples carried the signal back, if the structures they built ever completed their purpose, the hum would not remain buried. It would rise. One night, when the disciples gathered in the great chamber to complete their chants, I slipped away. I followed the faint tremors of memory, retracing steps I had once taken in the opposite direction. My body was weak, shaking from years of surrender, but the flicker of self drove me onward. I reached a narrow fissure where air smelled fresher, cleaner, touched by rain. I pressed my face to the crack, breathing in the world I had lost, and for a moment, I felt human again. But the hum surged violently, rattling the fissure, stone collapsing to seal it. I fell back, coughing in dust, the fresh air gone. The mountain had noticed my absence, and it was angry. When I returned, the disciples were waiting. They did not question, did not accuse. They only looked at me with eyes glowing faintly, and one of them, gray-haired, once the leader, spoke in a voice that was both his and not his. You are the bridge. You cannot leave. Through you it began. Through you it will continue. The others nodded, their voices joining in a unified tone that shook the chamber. I collapsed, trembling, as the hum filled me again, silencing the flicker of rebellion. And in that moment, I understood. I was not prisoner or prophet. I was conduit. Whatever the mountains sought to send into the world, it would pass through me first. Thought of the explorers' families above, who would search in vain for answers. I thought of towns built on valleys where the hum might someday rise, carried through stone and soil into their bones. I thought of myself, once a man, now a vessel hollowed out by sound. And I realized the truth I had resisted for 6 long years. There would be no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone who had heard the signal. The mountain had waited centuries in silence, patient, biding its time. Now, through us, it was ready to speak to the world. If I am speaking now, it is only because the mountain allows me. My words are not entirely my own anymore. They are braided with the hum, carried by it, reshaped by it. Yet somewhere in the folds of my mind, the last remnant of who I once was still lingers, clinging to memory, clawing against the tide. That is the part of me that remembers sunlight on leaves, the smell of rain on Appalachian soil, the laughter of people I loved before I vanished. But that part grows weaker each day, drowned beneath the resonance that has become my heartbeat. I am not telling this story to seek rescue, for I know none will come. I tell it so that if these words ever reach beyond the stone, someone will understand what waits beneath the mountains, what hums there, what whispers there, what builds its chorus with every lost soul it consumes. The disciples are no longer many. Some have gone deeper than even I dared follow, swallowed by tunnels that spiral endlessly downward. I hear their voices sometimes, distant, muffled, as though rising from beneath an ocean. Others have been taken by the pool, their bodies dissolved into light, their essence rethreaded into the mountain's pulse. The few who remain guard me, though not out of malice. They call me the bridge, the conduit, the first vessel. Without me, they believe the signal would fracture, falter. They believe I am the anchor that binds them to the mountain's will. Perhaps they are right. I feel the pull of it inside me, a current flowing outward, upward, as though my very veins are wires strung to an unseen tower. I am a transmitter now, my existence reduced to function, my thoughts to static. But static carries meaning too. I have learned to bend it, to hide words within the signal, faint distortions in the resonance. That is how I know this telling might reach ears above ground. If you are reading, if you are hearing, then understand, the signal is not just sound. It is an infection, subtle and sweet, threading itself into thought until it no longer feels foreign. You may not even notice it at first. The way your hands tap to a rhythm you cannot place, the way silence feels heavy, demanding to be filled. That is how it begins. A hum in the corner of your awareness, a low vibration beneath the ordinary noises of life. And once you hear it, truly hear it, it will not let you go. I used to dream of rescue. I imagined explorers breaking through the rock, dragging me into daylight, letting the sun burn the sickness out of me. But now I see the futility of that dream. If they opened these tunnels fully, if they cut a path into the chambers, they would not be rescuing me. They would be releasing it. The mountain does not need to walk into the world. The world only needs to listen. Already, the structures the disciples have built tremble with potential, angled toward the cracks and fissures that reach the surface. Already, the hum threads upward, carried by stone and soil, seeking the ears of those above. If you have ever felt your phone buzz when it was silent, if you have ever heard a low note in the wind that no one else could, if you have ever lain awake at night with your bones vibrating for no reason, you have heard the beginning. You have already been touched. I think of the young woman often, the one the pool consumed. Her scream still echoes in me, though the disciples have long forgotten her face. I wonder if she was the lucky one, dissolved before the signal could rewrite her completely. I wonder if death was the only mercy left in these caverns. For me, no such release has come. The mountain keeps me alive, sustained by its hum, long past the point where hunger or thirst should have ended me. My flesh is thinner, translucent in places where veins glow faintly, but I do not rot. I do not end. That is the gift and the curse. Eternity in resonance. I was a man once, but men end. Now I am signal, and signals last forever. And still, some nights, if nights they can be called here, in this endless dark, I feel the flicker of rebellion. It is weak, almost extinguished, but it burns enough for me to shape these words, enough to leave this record. Maybe one day, someone will stumble upon the cave and hear my story etched into the hum. Maybe they will turn back before it claims them. Or maybe they will press deeper, as I once did, drawn by curiosity that masks itself as bravery. If so, then the cycle will continue, the chorus will swell, and the mountain will spread its signal wider still. I cannot stop it. All I can do is warn. Once you hear the hum, it is already too late. So I leave this not as a plea, but as a final confession. I vanished 6 years ago, though time has no meaning here. The man I was is gone, erased, hollowed, rewritten. What remains is the conduit, the transmitter, the bridge. Through me, the mountain speaks, and through the mountain, something older and vaster than time itself stirs awake. It has waited in silence for centuries, but silence never lasts. Listen closely, and you will hear it now, in the walls of your home, in the static of your radio, in the bones of your body when the night is too still. That vibration, that hum, it is not the world settling. It is not imagination. It is the mountain calling, reminding you that it is patient, that it is everywhere, that it will not be ignored. And when you hear it clearly, when the resonance fills you as it fills me, you will understand what I have come to accept. There is no escape, only surrender. The hum does not fade. The signal does not die. It waits, it grows, it becomes. I was the first voice, but I will not be the last. Soon, the chorus will rise, and when it does, the world above will finally hear what has whispered beneath its feet for so long. When that day comes, you will not remember these words as warning. You will remember them as prophecy. And you will hum with me,